know how to create tools and subtools, let's look at some of the other elements of the workspace. One of the most important elements would be your brush section. So if you go to the top left of your window, you will see a brush here. So if you click on this box, you'll see that it says brush, but by default, you can usually see the name of the brush. This is what you'll see by default, the standard brush. And if you click on that, you get a whole bunch of other brush options. So you are not going to be clicking on this and selecting a brush. This is usually a very clunky way to work. So you'll learn some of the brush shortcuts, which we'll talk about in a whole separate video. But BCB is one that I like, clay buildup, and you have BMV, which I use a lot, which is just to move stuff around. So you have your brushes here on the left. And then right below that, you have the way that you want the brush to work. So by default, it's just stroke. So you can just draw on this. Let me go to a draw brush. So you have stroke, you have drag. So you could select a brush. Let's select the standard, and you could just drag. So that will just allow you to drag a shape across the surface. So you have how the brush works, and then you have the brush alpha, which is basically the shape that the brush uses. So a good way to see how the drag works instead of the stroke would be to select the alpha and then select a different shape from here. So let's select alpha 19, and if you drag that out, you'll see that that forms a shape right here. I am just going to add more resolution to this so we can actually see this in action. So you can see that we get this shape right here. So that's your alpha. Then you have texture. I don't really use this a lot, but you have that there. And you have your material, which is basically the material that is on this object. You can have different materials on different objects. I usually use Zbrush just for sculpting, so I don't change materials a lot, but you don't want to use the matte cap red wax usually because that has some baked lighting on it, so it might not be the most accurate result when you take this to another 3D software. So I changed this to basic material 2 or basic material. That'll just give you a more accurate result. Basic material 2 often shows you a lot of the mistakes that you might have. So this is a good one to keep it on. So you have that, and then you have the color of your material here, which is it's by default on white, and I leave it at that. I don't change that, but you can change the color if you want to. And you have you can switch colors. So there's black and white by default here. So if you just hit switch color or V on the keyboard, you can change which color you see your object in. So I keep it on white. And yeah, so you have these options. You have your brush options up here in this window. So here you have also you have your gizmo options that are basically doing the same thing, and we're on draw by default, and you have your brush options. I don't usually use this for changing the size of my brush. I just hit S on the keyboard to make my brush bigger or smaller, but you have the draw size here that will increase or decrease the size of the brush. You have Z intensity, so if I take this all the way up, you can see that it increases the intensity of that brush. So if I take this up to 73, you can see that that's bigger. It's basically causing more deformation, and a lower value will just cause less deformation on the mesh. And then you have your focal shift, which is interesting. So you have a draw size, which is basically the size that your brush draws in. I'm going to increase the intensity so this is more apparent. So you have your draw size. A focal shift is basically making your the thing that you've created here either more or less blurred out. So if I increase that, you can see how it becomes quite, okay, let's increase that. It becomes way less clear. It's kind of very blurred out. If I keep that somewhere in between, you can see that it's sort of blurring the edges of this object. And the higher that I go, it does that even more. And if I reduce that all the way down, it's going to make my object a lot sharper. So this is at a focal shift -80. Let's type in 0. So this is at a focal shift of 0. There is a slight blur to this object. And then you have a focal shift of, let's just do +80. So we can see that difference. You can see how it's very, very blurred. So the focal shift just changes how that alpha is drawn on the surface. So you can use that. And I just change the intensity and the focal shift from up here. There's definitely a way to do it from your workspace as well. I just don't use that shortcut very often. And finally, if you go to the right, you can see some other options right here. I use solo quite a lot. So if you click on solo, it basically makes this option the only object in the menu. So I'm going to turn on everything else so we can see that. So we have all our other objects visible now, and we also have this object visible. So sometimes you might want to just have this object visible. So then to do that, you click on solo, and that just isolates that object. Something to keep in mind for solo is that you'll notice that sometimes when you go back, let me turn that on. So if you're on solo and sometimes you go back to showing all the objects, you'll see that as you move around, the objects kind of disappear. And that's because by default, the solo button has this option called dynamic turned on. So I don't like it when this happens. I don't like to see my other objects disappear as I move around. So I just turn dynamic off. So now I can isolate when I need to, and then I can go back to regular mode without having stuff just move around. So these are some of the main menu options. There's another one that is dynamic perspective, which, so if you've noticed, if you create any object in Zbrush, let me just create a cube. It's because it's especially apparent on a cube. You'll see that there is no perspective on this cube. Everything in Zbrush is orthographic by default. So there's no lens distortion, there is no perspective. So this is useful when creating characters, but this is not the way you'll see stuff in other 3D software. So what I usually do is I switch between the orthographic and between the perspective. So if you turn on dynamic perspective, you can see that adds a perspective. You can change this somewhere. I just leave it at whatever the default is for the dynamic perspective. So I switch between these so I can see both views and make sure that my object works in the perspective view, because when you're doing anything in animation, when you're going to take this to a game engine or to another 3D software, you're going to see it with dynamic perspective. So you want to make sure that that is on. And that is basically it for the interface. And after this, we'll take a look at some of the brushes and how you would save your ZBrush files.